Let's take a look at reading comprehension in the GMAT. To be clear, we're talking about the verbal section, and these are the longer passages, each of which has 3 or 4 questions. The first thing to note is that you only see one question at a time, and you don't know what's coming up next. I believe that the best strategy is to invest some time in a first read of the passage before you even look at the first question. Remember that the GMAT is well designed to test your understanding and thinking skills, so trying to use tricks and shortcuts isn't a reliable approach. All the same, we want to make sure that we're reading in the right kind of way to prepare us for the questions. So let's look at the question types. For most passages, you'll see a general question, something about the overall meaning or purpose of the passage. It might also be about the structure, about how one sentence or paragraph relates to the rest. It's just about impossible to answer these questions unless you've read the whole passage. But you don't need to get all the details to answer these. Then there are detail questions. These can be very specific, and we might need to return to the passage to hunt for certain words or phrases. Next, you might see inference questions. See my other videos about these. Finally, there's often some crossover to critical reasoning, especially strengthen and weaken problems. Note that these categories aren't perfect. The GMAT doesn't want you to be too comfortable, and there are a few questions that don't fit neatly into these categories, but this is a good starting point. In this video, I want to focus on general questions, so let's do an experiment. I'll give you a passage to read, and you just read it at your usual pace. However, time yourself on your phone or watch to see how long it takes you. Pause the video now and do that. How long did that first read take? If you are under 2 minutes, that's fine. It means that you'll have plenty of time to answer the questions. If you took 2 to 3 minutes, then perhaps you were focusing on too many details. If you took longer than 3 minutes, then you probably need to speed up your reading unless you qualify for extra time in the GMAT. I should note that changing your reading skills is difficult. Think how many hours in your life you've spent reading and how strong your reading habits are. Perhaps you haven't read that many books in English, and that's not something you can change quickly. Check out my blog article for more suggestions about this. One thing I'm not going to address in detail here is how to take notes as you read. I've seen a whole range of approaches. Sometimes taking notes can be a useful way to maintain your attention. Sometimes taking notes slows students down and distracts them. What I would say is that it's great to experiment. If you're someone who takes notes, then try a few passages without. And if you don't take notes, see what happens if you do. Find out what kinds of notes, if any, help you. Then, after doing some experiments, stick to a plan and practice it, so that when it comes to test day, you know if you're going to use notes or not. Okay, so I've distracted you for a minute. Let's get back to that passage. What was it all about? If it was an article in a magazine, then what could the headline be? Write it down. Here are some more questions we should be able to answer. Did the author have an opinion, or were there any other opinions expressed? What was the structure of the passage? I hope you noticed there were 2 paragraphs. How did they relate to each other? What was the purpose of the passage? What was the author trying to achieve? Were there any details that you skimmed and might need to come back to? Let's take another look at the passage. I hope you noticed the passage was about strategic partnerships. And then we've got an example of a company that apparently used them. Then this phrase is an important one. Not only does it show an opinion, but the word unquestioning suggests some criticism of that opinion. Then we have a description of some kind of trend. And this word, however, is a very important one. It's a kind of signpost word that helps us navigate the structure of the passage. Here, it's showing that the second paragraph is going to have some kind of contrast to the first one. This phrase shows the author's opinion. It's a very important one to note. Finally, we have market exchange relationships. And notice how they're not expecting you to be an expert in this area of business. They explain these technical terms in the passage. Back to our questions. So we had two paragraphs. The first described strategic partnerships, and the second was some kind of criticism. The author definitely had an opinion. The author thought that the experts were wrong. The purpose of the passage seemed to be to discredit some widely held opinion. Perhaps in this passage there weren't so many technical details that we might need to come back to. That question's probably more relevant to some science passages. What did your headline sound like? There are lots of good answers to this question. My suggestions might be strategic partnerships, the truth, or the myths about strategic partnerships, or experts get it wrong again. All of this is the kind of understanding that will help us answer a general question like this one, perhaps even without referring back to the passage. Pause the video now and choose an answer. The correct answer is C. Even if you got this one right, let's look closely at the process. The first word of each answer gives a purpose, and general questions often start like this. I'm going to call these purpose words, and it's worth getting to know how the GMAT uses them. If the passage was discussing something, we'd expect pros and cons. We'd also expect a more neutral tone than the one we saw. For explaining, we'd expect some reasons. For pointing out, we'd also expect some kind of neutral tone. So on the basis of these purpose words, I'd probably eliminate answers B, D, and E. And by the way, I'd recommend writing the letters A, B, C, D, E on your page and striking them off as you eliminate answers. Here's another technique that can help us. Take things that are mentioned in the answer choices and try to match them up to words or phrases in the passage. For example, answer A mentions economic factors, but I can't find any economic factors mentioned in the passage. Answer B mentions relative merits. Perhaps we might see these as the long-term collaborative aspects of strategic partnerships, but notice how they're not explicitly shown as merits. Answer C mentions a widely held assumption, and we can match that to this unquestioning belief. Also in answer C, the word challenging matches to this phrase, is unjustified. In answer D, the particular practice must be strategic partnerships. Answer E mentions certain differences, and I can see one, something about supply practices, this difference between strategic partnerships and market exchange relationships. However, that's only one difference, and this is where I can be very precise. If an answer mentions certain differences, plural, I must be able to find two or more differences in the passage. I call this technique matching, and it's very useful not only for general questions, but for other reading comprehension question types too. To conclude, here's what we explored. Invest time in a first read before looking at the questions. Look out for opinions, structure, and purpose. Practice this using that headline technique, and you could even apply this to non-GMAT texts as well. Then, knowing the question types is going to help you. Those general question types are helped by purpose words. And then matching will help with other question types as well. Check out the follow-up task below